August 19, 1944. The Adriatic coast of northern Italy, 20 kilometers south of Pesaro. A dirt road runs north through fields of sunflowers gone brown and brittle in the late summer heat, past stone farmhouses with their shutters drawn against a war that has settled into the ground around them like weather, become part of the terrain, the way floods and drought become part of the season, another annual fact to be accounted for and survived. The road follows the Foglia River for a time, tracing the riverbed through flat agricultural ground before climbing into the low hills that crowd against the Adriatic coast. And at the crest of those hills, buried into the rock and sealed in concrete and steel and the labor of thousands of workers who had been at this for the better part of a year, sits a position the German army calls the Grune Linie. The Allies call it the Gothic Line. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief South, calls it the last defensible barrier in Italy south of the Po Valley and the Alps, and he has specific architectural reasons to believe it will hold through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, absorbing whatever the Allied armies send against it and grinding them down until the war finds its conclusion somewhere else under conditions no one on either side of the wire has yet determined. What Kesselring did not know, as August of 1944 closed toward its end, was that the army coming at him across the Foglia had been learning, for 9 months and at considerable cost, exactly the specific problem the Gothic Line had been built to present. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening, to understand what happened here, and why German generals spent the autumn of 1944 writing post-battle assessments that returned, independently of each other, to the same observations about the army that had come at them across the Foglia. You have to start with what the Gothic Line actually was. Not a line on a planning map. A physical thing, concrete and wire and steel and carefully chosen ground, designed and built by men who had been given something unusual in the context of a war running into its 5th year. Organization Todt began work on the Adriatic sector of the Gothic Line in the autumn of 1943. The engineering teams and the labor gangs they directed had been able to work through the autumn, through the winter, through the spring, and into the summer of 1944 because the Allied campaign in Italy had been absorbing itself in one defensive line after another to the south. The Gustav Line held the Allies until May of 1944, 9 months of attritional fighting that consumed entire divisions and produced some of the hardest infantry battles of the European War. After Cassino fell and the Gustav Line broke, the Allies pursued a German army that retreated in good order, yielding the Caesar Line and the successive river positions between the Rapido and the Arno on schedules of German choosing, trading ground for time with a discipline that kept the front moving without ever allowing the Allies to convert a breakthrough into a pursuit. By the time the Allied advance slowed in the late summer of 1944, the German engineers on the Foglia had been working for nearly a year, and what they had built reflected the investment of that time. What existed along the north bank of the Foglia River and in the hills behind, it was a belt of fortifications running 8 to 10 kilometers in depth from the river to the secondary ridgelines above the coastal plain. Allied air reconnaissance had been photographing the position throughout the summer, and the analysis teams at 8th Army Headquarters had assembled from the accumulated film a detailed picture of its structure. The main defensive line sat on the high ground north of the Foglia, exploiting the elevation advantage to place observed and pre-registered fire on both the river crossings and the approach ground south of the river. Concrete reinforced machine gun positions were sited in mutual support, each covering the dead ground left by the adjacent positions, so that any attacking formation would be exposed to at least 2 independent fields of fire regardless of the approach route chosen. Anti-tank ditches cut across every terrain corridor that offered viable going for armor. Wire obstacles ran in multiple belts, the outer wire tied to the anti-tank ditch line, and the inner belts covering the main machine gun positions. Minefield patterns in the approaches were dense enough to appear as disturbed earth in the oblique photography. And throughout the position, at every likely crossing point and axis of advance, the registration data for German artillery and mortar crews represented months of careful calibration, the precise measurements that could put fire on any point in the approach ground within seconds of a forward observer's call. Kesselring had designed the position with the skill that had made him the most effective defensive commander the German army deployed in any theater of the war. Where the Apennines offered natural defensive strength in the central sector, he exploited it. Along the Adriatic sector, where the coastal strip offered flatter ground suitable for armored operations, the engineering depth compensated for what the topography did not provide. The position was designed to channel any attacking force into predictable approach corridors, to defeat armor with anti-tank guns sighted to cover the same ground from multiple angles, and to hold infantry in the wire, while pre-registered fire broke up the assault before it could close to fighting range. It was the product of 5 years of German experience at this specific problem, and had been built with sufficient time for the work to be done with the precision that time allowed. The formations defending the Adriatic sector matched the quality of the works they occupied. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff's 10th Army held this flank with the I Parachute Corps under General Alfred Schlemm, and the primary defensive formations included the 1st Parachute Division and elements of the 71st Infantry Division. The 1st Parachute Division had been at Cassino through the long winter of 1943 and 44, holding positions on Monte Cassino itself against Allied assaults that consumed Polish, Indian, New Zealand, and British formations in turn. The paratroopers who had held the monastery and the slopes below it were, in the assessment of every Allied commander who faced them, among the most capable infantry in the German order of battle in any theater. They knew their sector of the Gothic Line in the specific way that soldiers know ground they have prepared and occupied and patrolled for months. The knowledge of where the wire runs and where the minefields begin and what the approach looks like from the perspective of a man coming north across the Foglia in the dark. They had been told the position would hold. The force assembling south of the Metauro River to attack this position was the 1st Canadian Army, under General Harry Crerar, with the assault weight carried by 2 Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Ilm Burns. The Corps had been in Italy since July of 1943. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division had been in continuous contact with the German Army in Italy for 9 months. Its 3 infantry brigades had crossed the Sangro, fought through the Moro River bridgehead in the opening weeks of December 1943, cleared Ortona in 7 days of street fighting that produced some of the most intense urban combat of the Italian campaign, and worked through every subsequent defensive line that the German retreat had placed between the Sangro and the Foglia. The 5th Canadian Armored Division had operated alongside the infantry through the same sequence, developing in the process the tank infantry procedures that Italian terrain required and that no training establishment had been able to produce in advance. By August of 1944, the Corps had run more deliberate assaults against prepared German positions in Italian terrain than any comparable Allied formation of the same size. General Burns was not a man who inspired the kind of devotion that some commanders generate, and his relationship with General Leese and with the British Army headquarters above him in the chain of command was never warm. He was a professional soldier in the formal sense, systematic, analytical, methodical, not inclined toward the performed confidence that some commanders used as a leadership tool. His approach to the development of the Corps was the approach of an engineer working a problem, identifying the weaknesses in each operation's performance through after-action analysis, designing procedural corrections, and testing them in the next operation. The artillery-infantry timing that the German interrogation reports would identify as the most consistent tactical surprise of the Gothic Line assault was, in Burns's operational framework, a variable to be measured and improved. The improvements that the Corps had made to that timing between the Hitler Line in May and the Foglia in August were the product of exactly that kind of methodical analysis and procedural refinement, and they were as much a part of what made the Gothic Line assault succeed as the courage of the soldiers who carried it out. The Corps' Corps Artillery Commander, Brigadier P. Todd, worked the artillery coordination problem through every major operation of the Italian campaign with the same systematic approach. Todd's after-action analyses of the Hitler Line and the subsequent Liri Valley operations identified the specific points in the fire plan where the timing between suppression and assault had broken down and where the infantry had taken casualties in the gap. The refinements to the fire plan for Operation Olive addressed each of those failure points directly, adjusting the timing of specific lifts, increasing the density of suppression at positions identified as particularly dangerous to the closing infantry, and building into the plan the flexibility for the forward observers accompanying the assault to call adjustments in real time. The 600 guns that supported the Gothic Line assault were a major concentration of firepower, But the precision with which that firepower was applied was the product of the same analytical process that Burns and Todd had been running through every previous operation, and it was that precision, more than the volume, that the German prisoners identified as the element they had not been prepared for. The battle for Ortona in December of 1943 had marked the Corps in a specific and lasting way. The fighting ran from December 20th through December 28th in a coastal town whose stone buildings the Germans had prepared as individual fortresses, breaking up doors and cutting firing holes through walls and collapsing upper floors to create rubble fields that channeled movement into covered arcs of fire. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada cleared the town building by building, developing under fire the technique that became known as mouse-holing, blasting holes through the party walls between adjacent buildings to advance from room to room without exposing soldiers to the fire in the streets. When Ortona was finally Canadian on December 28th, the techniques that the two battalions had developed to take it became part of the training legacy that the Corps carried forward through every subsequent operation. The soldiers who had been at Ortona knew things about fighting through prepared German positions that could not be acquired any other way. The tactical evolution that the Canadian Corps underwent between Ortona in December of 1943 and the Foglia crossing in August of 1944 was not a smooth progression. It was built through the specific failures and partial successes and hard-won solutions that characterize any army that has been fighting long enough to learn from its own experience. The Hitler Line assault in May of 1944 was one of those learning events. The Hitler Line, anchored on the town of Aquino in the Liri Valley, was a prepared defensive position of the same order of depth and technical sophistication as the Gothic Line, and the first Canadian assault on it on May 23, 1944, was costly in a way that revealed specific weaknesses in the Corps' assault procedure. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade's attack on the Hitler Line's right sector ran into problems with the timing between the lifting of artillery suppression and the arrival of the assault infantry at the wire obstacles, the same interval that would become the focus of the Corps artillery's refinements before the Foglia. The casualties taken in the breach phase were disproportionately concentrated in that specific interval. The after-action analysis that followed the Hitler Line battle was thorough, and the adjustments to the artillery-infantry coordination that it produced were incorporated into the planning for subsequent operations. By August of 1944, the specific problem that had cost the Corps so heavily at the Hitler Line had been addressed in the Corps artillery plan with a precision that the Hitler Line's defenders had not encountered. The physical geography of the Italian Adriatic coast imposed specific constraints on both the German defensive planning and the Canadian assault approach that are worth understanding in detail. The coastline runs roughly northwest to southeast in the sector where the Gothic Line met the Adriatic, and the terrain between the coast and the Apennine foothills is a series of parallel ridgelines and river valleys that cross the axis of any northward advance at roughly regular intervals. Each ridgeline and each river valley was a potential defensive line, and the German withdrawal through this sector from the Sangro to the Foglia had been conducted as a series of rearguard actions on these successive features, each one yielding on German terms after inflicting the maximum possible delay on the pursuing Allied forces. The Canadians had crossed the Sangro, the Moro, the Riccio, the Arieli, the Pescara, and the Chieti in sequence, and each crossing had added to the Corps' accumulated understanding of the specific problems that forcing a defended river line in this terrain presented. By the time they reached the Foglia, they had run the same problem in the same theater more times than any comparable formation in the Allied order of battle, and the institutional memory of those crossings was embedded in the standard operating procedures that the assault battalions carried to the North Bank. The intelligence preparation for the Gothic Line assault was more thorough than any the Canadian Corps had conducted in Italy. 8th Army had been collecting information on the Gothic Line's construction and layout for months, and by August of 1944 the intelligence picture available to the Corps and its subordinate formations was detailed enough to inform the specific planning of each battalion's assault axis. The aerial photography provided the layout of the defensive works in sufficient detail for the Corps artillery to assign specific strong points to specific battery concentrations. Ground reconnaissance, conducted by patrols from the Canadian cavalry regiments and the Corps' intelligence staff, had identified the Foglia's crossing points and characterized the approach ground north of the river in terms of its going for armor and the observation it provided for German forward observers. Captured prisoners from the forward positions of the 1st Parachute Division in the weeks before the assault had provided information about the manning levels and routine of the forward positions that contributed directly to the timing of the assault. The planning process that produced the Operation Olive attack plan was the most technically detailed the Canadian Corps had run, and it reflected the Corps' accumulated experience at every stage of the intelligence to operations sequence. The plan for what became Operation Olive was developed by General Sir Oliver Leese, commanding the British 8th Army, and it was built around a deception that proved as consequential as any element of the assault itself. Through August of 1944, every visible indicator of Allied intent in Italy pointed toward the central Apennine sector. The American 5th Army and British formations were concentrated west of the Apennines, and German intelligence assessments had been tracking the buildup in the mountains for weeks. The 8th Army's shift to the Adriatic coast for Operation Olive was conducted under security conditions that were exceptional in a theater where concealing corps-sized movements was physically difficult. Units moved exclusively at night. Wireless traffic was shaped to patterns that concealed the scale of the concentration. Vehicle identification markings were removed. Administrative movements were staged to mask their purpose. The deception held. German intelligence assessments in the days immediately before the assault on August 25 still attributed the main Allied effort to the mountains. When the Canadians crossed the Metauro, the defenders on the Gothic Line were oriented against a threat that was not coming. Leese's operational concept was built around the timeline on which the Gothic Line's defensive plan depended. The German defensive architecture assumed a specific window between the opening of an Allied assault and the moment when the main defensive position was genuinely threatened, a window derived from the operational tempo that the 8th Army had demonstrated through 1943 and the spring of 1944. In that window, reserves would move forward, positions would be fully manned, and artillery would be re-registered on the developing threat. Leese's plan was to compress that window below the threshold the defensive plan required. The assault would open before the final preparations on the forward works were complete. The pace of advance from the Metauro to the Foglia would be set to arrive at the main position before the German planning sequence had run its course. The Canadian Corps crossed the Metauro on the night of August 25, 1944, and the record of the following 24 hours in the war diaries of the assault formations carries the specific texture of events moving faster than headquarters can fully process. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Royal Canadian Regiment, the 48th Highlanders of Canada, and the Royal 22nd Regiment. These battalions crossed the Foglia with the accumulated competence of formations that had been conducting assault crossings under fire since December of 1943. The assessments that emerged from multiple independent sessions with prisoners from different units and different sectors of the Gothic Line were consistent across 3 observations, stated in different formulations, but pointing to the same analysis. The speed of Canadian movement at night was the observation that appeared most consistently. The German defensive planning had built into its timeline a measurable reduction in the pace of an attacking formation operating at night over unfamiliar ground, an assumption based on the observable operational tempo of the 8th Army through the previous year's fighting. German defensive doctrine assumed that attacking formations moving in darkness would pause more frequently to consolidate, would be more susceptible to disruption by the indirect fire and local counterattacks designed to break an assault's momentum, and would be unable to maintain the inter-unit coordination that a daylight advance could sustain through visual signals and landmarks. The Canadians did not behave according to those assumptions. They maintained direction and unit cohesion in darkness, kept moving when the German planning called for a pause, and arrived at positions earlier in the operational sequence than the staff had calculated was achievable by a formation of this scale on this ground in these conditions. The artillery coordination was the second consistent observation. The timing between the suppression of a position by Canadian artillery and the arrival of Canadian infantry at that position was, in the assessments of multiple captured officers from different units, tighter than anything they had observed in previous 8th Army operations against German defensive positions in Italy. The interval between the lifting of fire from a position and the closing of the assault infantry was the critical measurement in every defended assault, the window in which survivors of the suppression recovered, stood up, cleared their weapons, and engaged. Reducing that interval had been the persistent technical challenge of the Canadian Corps artillery planning throughout the Italian campaign. By August of 1944, the Corps had reduced it below the threshold on which the Gothic Line's defensive procedures had been calibrated. An assessment recorded in an 8th Army Intelligence Summary from the first week of September of 1944, now preserved in the WO-169 series at Q, notes the specific statement of a German regimental commander captured near the Pesaro Road, that the speed of the Canadian advance on the night of August 26 had disrupted the scheduled relief of forward positions on the main Gothic Line defensive sector. The positions had been occupied in reduced strength. The relief had not been completed because the Canadian assault had arrived before the scheduled relief time. He was accounting, in the specific professional language of a staff officer analyzing a tactical failure, for what the Canadian speed had cost his defense at the critical moment. The combined arms coordination was the third consistent observation in the interrogation reports. German staff officers analyzing the Gothic Line breach noted that the relationship between the infantry advance, the armored support, and the artillery suppression had been more precisely sequenced than the German planning had assessed the 8th Army was capable of delivering in the conditions of the Adriatic sector. This was not a compliment in the German staff usage of post-battle analysis. It was the professional observation of soldiers identifying why their defensive plan had failed on a timeline their calculations had assessed as achievable. General von Vietinghoff's formal post-battle assessment of the Gothic Line operation is a careful document written by a methodical professional soldier. He identifies 3 factors: the Allied deception that prevented timely identification of the main effort's direction and timing, the artillery preparation, more concentrated and more precisely timed than the standard the German staff had associated with 8th Army operations, and the speed of the Canadian infantry advance, which reduced the interval available for the defensive plan's execution below the threshold the plan required. The assessment does not invoke luck. It attributes the outcome, in the language of German staff analysis, to an adversary that had performed at a standard the defensive plan had not been built to defeat. The post-battle period produced a broader reckoning in German operational thinking about the performance of the Canadian Corps that went beyond the specific factors that von Vietinghoff had identified in his assessment. General Hans Roettiger, Kesselring's chief of staff in the Italian theater, prepared a broader analysis of the 8th Army's performance in the Gothic Line operation in the weeks following the breakthrough. Roettiger's document, which survives in the captured German records, addresses the question of why the Allied operational tempo at the Foglia had exceeded the tempo that German planning had assumed was achievable. His conclusion was that the 8th Army had, in the Canadian Corps, a formation whose operational standard had advanced materially beyond the level that German intelligence had attributed to it based on the Corps' earlier performance in the Italian campaign. The assessment notes that the Corps' performance at the Foglia was substantially better coordinated and faster moving than its performance at the Sangro and the Moro crossings of the previous winter, and attributes this to the development of tactical and operational competence through operational experience in conditions of sustained combat against German defensive positions. Roettiger's analysis was among the clearest German acknowledgments, in the formal language of staff assessment, that the Canadian Corps had become something different from the formation it had been when it entered the Italian campaign in the summer of 1943. The individual soldiers and officers who carried out the Gothic Line assault came from a country that in the summer of 1944 was 3 years into a total war effort that had transformed its military from the small professional and militia force of 1939 into an army of hundreds of thousands. The men crossing the Foglia were volunteers, every one of them. The difference between a battalion in its first contested river crossing and one in its 10th shows in every phase of the operational record. Bridgeheads were seized and consolidated against immediate counterattack. Engineer squadrons worked under direct fire to position crossing equipment without losing the momentum the infantry had established. Communication between forward infantry, engineers, and the armored units waiting on the south bank held at moments when it would have failed in formations without the same collective experience at this specific problem. By the morning of August 26th, Canadian infantry were on the north bank in strength. The approach to the main Gothic Line works was open, and the German timetable had already begun to fracture. The 5 days of fighting from the Foglia crossing to the breach of the main Gothic Line position left a specific record in the unit war diaries and after-action reports, and that record carries the honest character of what the assault cost and what it achieved. The 48th Highlanders of Canada, attacking on the right of the 1 SD Division's axis in the first days of the breakthrough, took their objectives on the high ground north of the Foglia, against positions the after-action report describes with the precision of a document written by men who were present, heavily wired, with concrete reinforced machine gun emplacements covering the wire obstacles from 3 separate positions, 2 of which had to be taken by direct assault after artillery suppression failed to neutralize them. The casualties in those assaults were taken in the final 100 yards before the wire, in the interval between the end of the suppression and the moment when the infantry closed to grenade range, the interval the entire artillery plan had been designed to close. The Royal Canadian Regiment's crossing of the Conca River in the days following the Foglia breakthrough was made in daylight, under direct fire, across 300 yards of open ground with no natural cover on the south bank. The regimental diary records the problem in a sentence and records that the crossing was made. Behind that sentence is the experience of men who have been solving exactly this problem, river after river, since December of 1943, who know what the crossing will cost, and who make it anyway because the task has been assigned to them, and they're the formation assigned to carry it. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry found a concrete machine gun emplacement near Montecchio in the first week of September that had not been identified in pre-assault intelligence, positioned to cover a gully that aerial photography had shown as dead ground. The platoon that found it by walking into its field of fire. A citation in the Canadian War Museum's collection in Ottawa records what followed. The platoon sergeant, having lost his officer and 2 section commanders in the first seconds of contact, reorganized the surviving soldiers under fire, identified a flanking approach through the western slope of the gully, and took the emplacement with the men he had remaining. The position is marked on the operational map attached to the citation. The sergeant's name appears in the Canadian casualty records for that date, wounded and evacuated. He survived. The armor dimension of the Gothic Line assault carried its own layer of accumulated competence. The 5th Canadian Armored Division's Shermans had spent months adapting to Italian terrain that no armor doctrine written in Britain or Canada had anticipated. The narrow roads flanked by stone walls, the irrigation channels that broke the ground into compartments, the terraced hillsides that confined tanks to predictable lines of advance, the German anti-tank screen of pack 40-75mm guns and 88mm guns in defilade positions that could kill a Sherman at ranges well beyond the Sherman's own effective engagement range. These were the conditions the Canadian armored units had been working in since the Leary Valley, and the procedures they had developed for operating in these conditions were not available in any doctrinal publication. They had been developed under fire, at cost, by officers and NCOs who had survived long enough to learn them, and who had written them down in after-action reports and training notes that circulated through the division. Several of those procedures were subsequently incorporated into 8th Army training pamphlets. The knowledge was specific, and it was transferable because it had been won in the precise conditions for which it was needed. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The interrogation reports assembled by Allied intelligence teams in the weeks following the Gothic Line battle are held in the Canadian Department of National Defence Archives in Ottawa and in the British National Archives Series WO-169 at Kew. The captured German officers were professional soldiers in the tradition of the German General Staff, trained to analyze battles with the same methodical precision they were trained to plan them. They were answering questions put to them by experienced interrogators working through interpreters, and the requirement was to provide information of operational value. The Canadians found a way to work the ground that made their job harder, and the record of how they found it runs back through every armored action from the Leary Valley to the Sangro. The Canadian Corps' medical and administrative services ran through the Gothic Line and Coriano fighting with the same operational efficiency that characterized the combat performance of the assault formations. The casualty handling arrangements that moved wounded soldiers from the forward dressing stations to the casualty clearing stations to the field hospitals in the rear were the product of 9 months of experience at managing the flow of casualties in sustained offensive operations. The number of soldiers who reached surgical care in time because the evacuation system was running efficiently is not recorded in the casualty returns, but it is part of the overall operational picture that produced the results of the Foglia and on the Coriano Ridge. The administrative and medical services of a corps on sustained offensive operations are not a separate function from the combat performance of its assault formations. They are part of the same organizational capability and the same operational experience that made the Canadian Corps' assault procedure more effective by August of 1944 had made its administrative services more efficient in precisely the same way. Rimini fell on September 21st. The Po Valley lay open. The plan had assumed that opening the Po Valley Road would produce the conditions for decisive mobile operations that would end the Italian campaign before winter. It did not, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Canadian Corps. The Eighth Army was exhausted after months of continuous offensive operations. The autumn rains came early and heavy, filling the irrigation channels and rivers of the Po Valley and turning the low-lying ground into obstacle belts of a different kind from the ones the Canadians had just broken through. And Kesselring conducted the autumn withdrawal with the same disciplined skill that had characterized the entire Italian campaign, trading ground for time and giving the Allied armies nothing that could be converted into a pursuit. The Gothic Line was cracked in 5 days. The Italian campaign did not end at the Foglia River. The distinction gives the operation its honest weight, a success of the first order that opened a door the German defensive planning had been built to keep shut, and that forced Kesselring into the improvised autumn posture from which the subsequent Allied operations exacted a continuing price. General Burns was removed from command of 2 Canadian Corps in October of 1944 and replaced by Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes. The removal a product of the friction that develops between a Corps commander and the Army headquarters above him under sustained operational pressure. The record of his Corps' performance at the Gothic Line stands independently of what happened to him. He had built, through the Italian campaign, an operational instrument the Gothic Line had not been designed to defeat, and the battle at the Foglia was the evidence. The concrete emplacements above the Foglia River are still accessible to anyone who walks the hills behind Pesaro today. The firing slits are still oriented to cover the approach ground from the south. The steel reinforcing rods are visible where the outer surface has spalled away over 8 decades of weather. The Museo della Linea Gotica near Ortona in the Marche region holds German engineering drawings for sections of the defensive works recovered from the rubble of a command post after the breakthrough. The drawings show with technical precision the depth of what was built, the calculated overlapping fields of fire, the pre-registered mortar positions, the anti-tank ditch profiles. What those drawings do not and cannot show is the army that arrived at those positions on a timeline the drawings assumed was not achievable. The Gradara War Cemetery sits on a small rise a few kilometers south of Pesaro, surrounded by agricultural ground that in August looks much as it did in 1944. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains the site, and the headstones stand in rows, each one carrying a name, a rank, a unit, and a date. The Canadian headstones carry the maple leaf. The dates cluster in the last week of August and the first 3 weeks of September 1944, the operational calendar of the Gothic Line and Coriano battles written in the form that does not change. The cemetery holds just under 1,100 Commonwealth graves. A visitor who walked the rows and read the dates would have the sequence of the fighting before them in the most exact form the record can offer. The closing months of the Italian campaign, from the capture of Rimini in September of 1944 through the German surrender in May of 1945, saw the Canadian Corps continue operations in the Po Valley and along the Senio and Reno rivers in weather and terrain conditions that the Foglia assault had not had to contend with. The autumn rains that arrived in October of 1944 turned the irrigation channels of the Po Valley into serious tactical obstacles and reduced the rate of advance to the kind of attritional progress that characterized the Italian campaign at its most grinding. The Germans held successive river lines through the autumn and the winter, and the operational experience the Canadians had accumulated in the assault crossing problem was applied, in reduced conditions of visibility and mobility, through every one of those crossings. The individual soldiers who had crossed the Foglia under summer conditions crossed the Limone and the Senio and the Reno in the mud and cold of an Italian winter, against an adversary that was depleted but not broken, and that continued to resist with the professional stubbornness that had characterized the German army in Italy from the beginning. The cumulative record of those winter crossings confirms that the operational standard the Canadian Corps had reached by August of 1944 was maintained through the remainder of the Italian campaign, even as the conditions became more difficult and the scale of the operation smaller. Canada had held a conscription referendum in April of 1942, but the dispatch of conscript to overseas service remained a point of intense political controversy throughout the war, and the overseas army that fought in Italy was composed of men who had enlisted. The battalions that carried the assault were drawn from every province and every social background that Canada contained in 1944, men from the farms of Ontario and Quebec and the prairie provinces who had been in the army since 1939 or 1940, alongside men who had enlisted after the fall of France or after Pearl Harbor or in the months when the news from North Africa had made it clear that the war would be long and that the outcome would require every man who could be put in uniform and trained and equipped and transported across an ocean. By August of 1944, those men had been in Italy for a year. The younger soldiers who had replaced the casualties of the earlier fighting had been absorbed into formations that carried the institutional knowledge of the Sangro and Ortona and the Hitler Line, and that knowledge had been passed down through the NCOs and company commanders who had survived those engagements and who had been teaching it in the way that soldiers teach combat experience to the men who arrived as reinforcements in the months that followed. The logistical dimension of the Gothic Line assault receives less attention in the campaign narratives than the tactical performance of the assault formations, but it was as important to the outcome as any element of the combat plan. The Canadian Corps' crossing of the Metauro on the night of August 25th required the movement of tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of vehicles and guns into the forward assembly areas under blackout conditions, the positioning of engineer bridging equipment at the crossing sites, and the maintenance of the fuel and ammunition supply that 600 guns and the armored squadrons of the 5th Division required to sustain the assault through its first days. The Corps administrative staff had been running this kind of logistical preparation across 9 months of operations in Italy, and the efficiency with which the Gothic Line buildup was conducted under the security constraints of the deception plan reflected the same accumulated operational experience that showed in the performance of the assault battalions of the Foglia. The breakdowns and delays that had characterized the early Italian campaign logistics were absent from the Gothic Line preparation. The supply system worked because the people running it had been running it long enough to know where it would fail and how to prevent the failure before it occurred. The consequences of the Canadian speed extended beyond the tactical situation at the Foglia. Kesselring had intended to use the time a deliberate Corps-scale assault would consume to redeploy reserves from the central sector to the Adriatic flank once the main Allied effort was confirmed. The compression of the assault timeline denied him that time in the phase of the battle when it was most consequential. The 26th Panzer Division, Kesselring's primary armored counterattack force for the Adriatic sector, was caught in transit when the Canadian advance moved faster than the German staff's calculations had allowed. The division could not concentrate and deliver a coordinated armored intervention in the days of late August, when timely commitment might have stabilized the position north of the Foglia. By the time the panzers were available in strength, the moment for a decisive armored counterattack had already closed. The Coriano Ridge fighting that followed the Foglia breakthrough extended the Canadian Corps' operational sequence through the first 3 weeks of September of 1944. The ridge runs roughly east to west across the axis of advance toward Rimini, dominating the approaches to the coastal road and the Po Valley beyond it. The Germans held it as a deliberate defensive position with formations that retained the professional quality that characterized the German army in Italy even in this phase of the campaign. The 1st Parachute Division elements that had survived the Gothic Line fighting and the formations brought up from reserve to hold the Coriano position were not troops in the process of collapse. They were conducting a deliberate rearguard defense on ground of their choosing, and they made the Canadians pay for every approach to the ridge with the registered fire and local counterattack that were the tools of their trade. The 5th Canadian Armored Division's losses at Coriano exceeded 800 all ranks killed, wounded, and missing. Total Canadian casualties across the Gothic Line and Rimini Line operations from late August through the capture of Rimini on September 21st exceeded 4,000. The number appears in the casualty returns in the enumerated form of a military accounting, and what it represents, in every case, is a name removed from the nominal roll of a platoon or section or tank crew that continued its advance without him. The Coriano Ridge fighting was also where the 5th Canadian Armored Division demonstrated most clearly what 9 months of Italian fighting had built in its armored regiments, and in the infantry brigades it worked alongside. The ridge's western approaches were dominated by anti-tank fire from positions on the reverse slope that were invisible to advancing tanks until they crested the forward slope and came under fire. The technique that the Governor-General's Horse Guards and the 8th Princess Louise's New Brunswick Hussars had developed for dealing with this specific problem, working with the infantry from the British Columbia Dragoons to identify and engage the anti-tank positions with artillery before the tanks moved, coordinating the tank advance with the infantry advance in a sequence that used each arm to protect the other, was visible in the Coriano fighting in a way that it had not been visible in the earlier operations of the Italian campaign. The after-action reports of the Coriano engagement credit this coordination with reducing armored losses on the ridge's western approaches substantially below what the defensive layout of the position would have been expected to produce. The German anti-tank crews on the reverse slope were professionals who had been killing Allied tanks in Italy for a year. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 5th Canadian Armored Division transferred to Northwest Europe in the spring of 1945, arriving in the Netherlands in time for the final weeks of the campaign. The operational records describe formations that carried everything the Italian campaign had built in them into a different theater. The German army they faced in Holland in April of 1945 was an accelerating collapse, without the reserves or the professional tenacity that the 1st Parachute Division had demonstrated at the Foglia. The distance between those two German armies, the one that had held Cassino and built the Gothic Line, and the one that was giving up the Netherlands in the spring of 1945, was the distance 8 months of attrition had opened across every theater of the war, and the Gothic Line battle was part of what had produced that distance. The German generals who wrote their post-battle assessments in the autumn of 1944 arrived, by different analytical routes, at the same conclusion. The Canadians had developed, through 9 months of fighting in Italy against the best defensive infantry the German army deployed in that theater, an operational standard that the Gothic Line had not been built to defeat. The assessments said this in the careful language of professional soldiers, accounting for an outcome they had not anticipated. The operational record of the Canadian Corps said the same thing in the language of distances covered, and river lines crossed, and positions taken on a timeline the defensive planning had assessed as unachievable. The names in the Gradara cemetery said it in the only form that admits of no subsequent revision. The Gothic Line was built to hold through the winter of 1944. The army that cracked it in 5 days came from a country that in September of 1939 had possessed a permanent force of fewer than 5,000 soldiers. What that army became between Sicily in July of 1943 and the Foglia in August of 1944 was built on the job, at the cost the casualty returns record, against an adversary that was formidable in every professional sense. The interrogation rooms behind the Gothic Line were where that adversary was asked to account for what had happened to it, and what the captured German officers said, in their careful and consistent assessments, was that the Canadians had become an army that the Gothic Line had not been designed to stop. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.